Hi, friends. Good to be home. I'm standing in downtown Nairobi, Kenya, outside this nondescript building with peach-colored walls and a heavy iron door. And from the outside, it looks like every ordinary building in the capital, except it's not ordinary. It's extraordinary. It is like the most important building in all of East Africa. It's the International Organization for Migration's headquarters, departure center, where refugees go for their last stop before they're resettled to countries worldwide. I'm standing in downtown Nairobi, Kenya, because 10 years ago, my life changed when 5,000 Somali immigrants moved into my hometown of Lewiston, Auburn, Maine. You might know it. My life changed because I had just graduated college and I was supposed to go to Africa to actually work in East Africa, but as my mom likes to say, Africa came to me. And at that point, I started getting hired to help refugees find jobs and housing and get enrolled in school, and it transformed how I looked at America and suddenly launched me into this career whereby I've spent the last 10 years traveling around the United States helping other cities figure out how to welcome refugees and get them jobs and housing and enrolled in schools. Except there was always this nagging feeling that I never got to go abroad and really see the circumstances that refugees lived in before they came to the United States, in refugee camps in urban areas like Eastleigh in Kenya. And so when the opportunity presented itself to move to Boston to work for an organization that would send me abroad to see where the Somali refugees came from, I leapt on it. And so here I am, standing in a parking lot, holding the hand of a young Ethiopian refugee boy who's about to be resettled to Seattle, Washington. He was 2 years old when his parents were dragged from his home at gunpoint by the Ethiopian military. His family had been having a big celebration because they were agriculturalists and farmers, and they'd had a particularly great harvest, so they invited their friends and neighbors and cousins and the whole neighborhood to come to their house. And somehow the military misinterpreted this as some sort of political uprising, so they sent in soldiers who stormed the door and grabbed Joseph by his arms and threw him against the wall at the age of 2.5, and then put a gun to his parents and dragged them from the home. It's the last time Joseph has seen his parents. His grandmother that night wrapped up he and his 2 older brothers and took them from the home and paid a little bit of money to people to take them across the border into Kenya, where they spent the next 8 years barely surviving, selling scrap metal on the streets to people and hawking whatever they could to feed themselves. When I visited them over 7 days, all I ever saw them eat was 2 things: potatoes that the grandmother would peel with her aging fingers, and a mango that the local fruit vendor would always give and sneak over to Joseph on a Friday afternoon if he had some left over. As I stood outside, Joseph looks up at me and he says, "So what's Seattle like?" And this question is always so hard. So I start rambling about coffee. I'm like, there's a lot of coffee in Seattle. You'll really like it. And there's this market where they're going to throw fish at you. And there's this Space Needle. And around the time I started talking about the Space Needling, I think he looked a little panicked. And he's already panicked because he's about to leave the only place he's ever known. And he's going to go live with a family who he's never met. But he will finally have legal rights. And so as we walk up to the door, the guard pushes open the door and we enter this courtyard of the departure center, and it is bustling with activity. In every single corner are South Sudanese, Somalis, Congolese, Ethiopian families waiting for their last hours before they'll go to the airport. It's a critical hour because they can still be held back. They have to have one more security check and one more medical appointment. And if they don't pass, they don't get on the white bus with the big blue emblem that says IOM. So as we sit for hours and wait, I start looking around the room, and there's this long line of suitcases. And every suitcase has a piece of masking tape on it that has the name of a family, their case number, and their destination. Paris, France, San Diego, California, Sydney, Australia, and there, 5 suitcases back, is this little smaller black bag with a big piece of tape that says, Lewiston, Maine. And I lose my mind. Oh my God, whose bag is this? Whose bag is this? Nobody wants to claim the bag from the screaming white woman. I quickly gesture over to this interpreter. I'm like, you gotta understand. You've gotta figure out whose bag this is. Tell them it's not a problem. I swear it's not a problem. And this whispering train begins through the crowd, and it weaves its way back until it lands on a woman near the back, sitting on a bench with 3 other young boys wearing a blue hijab. I run back to her, and I'm like, "Hi, salam alaikum, my name is Cheryl. You're going to my hometown!" The interpreter then interprets what I've just said, And we begin a conversation, and she smiles. And I tell her how happy I am, that she's gonna love Maine. It has these fantastic mountains and beautiful oceans, and the schools are really good, and I loved growing up there. I love Maine. I don't tell her that 10 years ago when I entered the field, the mayor of Lewiston said that more or less the Somalis weren't welcome. I don't tell her that his comments led to the fact that hate groups came to Lewiston and would stand on the parking lots of school playgrounds and pass out crossword puzzles that once completed celebrated people like Hitler and the Aryan race. I don't tell her that people who graduated from Edward Little High School would stop me at bars when I was 22 and 23 and say I was a mud lover, or told me that I brought terrorists to our hometown and that I should stop. I don't tell her this because it's not where Lewiston is today. 10 years ago, sure, there's still some bias, and there are days that I know inappropriate things are said, but it's come a long way. Over 50 Somali businesses have been opened. Over 5 different African communities have opened nonprofits. LL Bean, they were able to fix that backlog of the boots because Somali women stood on the factory lines and sewed those LL Bean shoes. I was so proud of that. And most recently, let's shout out to the soccer team at Lewiston High School, who had refugee children who came from camps in Kenya, who lived in a camp where 600,000 people reside, a camp that right now the Kenyan government is considering shutting down, displacing nearly 1 million people, or almost as many people as in Maine. As I talk to her, though, I think, I just look at her and I say, well, I'm really happy for you again, and do you know anybody in Lewiston? Expecting the answer to be pretty much Muhammad Ali, which would really not narrow it down for me. And instead, she gives me a name. And just as shocked as I was with the bag, I know the gentleman she mentions. I was like, you mean? And she tells me, and it's one of the first peers I ever worked with in Lewiston. It's one of the few people that I credit with teaching me about Islam and about the refugee journey. And it's one of the people I know that had been separated from his wife and children for nearly a decade. And now I am beaming. But I suddenly hear Joseph's voice saying, Cheryl! It's because they're about to board the bus, and I'm like, oh God, I gotta go. So I run back to Joseph, who's holding his suitcase, which has literally only 2 things in it. The t-shirt he's worn every day for 7 days, and the little jacket that he and I bought yesterday from a market because he's going to Seattle and it's gonna be cold. He wanted to buy the bright pink one with the little stars all over it, but I explained to him that I thought integrating into school would be better with a blue jacket, and I feel kind of guilty about this. But he has it in his bag, and he's wearing this fabulous corduroy suit with these big brown buttons. It's so dated. I remember my brother David having one. But he tells me that his neighbor said he had to look sharp for going to America. So I say, okay, it's time. And he picks up the bag, and he climbs on the step of the bus, and he looks back at me, and I think about his future, and I think about the fact that finally he will have an education. And then, as I look back to the woman, she picks up her 3 boys, and they start walking toward the bus. And I look at her straight in the eyes, and I say, safe travels. I'll see you at home, my home. Thank you.